Hi, grade 4. Today's science lesson is called Measuring Tools. In today's lesson, we will learn about a lot of things. We will learn about mass, volume, length, and the different kinds of measuring tools. First of all, let's start with matter. What is matter? Well, matter is the stuff around you. Anything that is around you is matter. Anything that has mass and occupies space is matter. So basically, anything that you can touch is made out of matter. Let me give you examples. Do you see this fruit, the strawberry? That is an example of matter. Do you see that loaf of bread? That is also an example of matter. Do you see that pea? That is also an example of matter. And then finally the giraffe, also another example of matter. Now, let's take a look at what mass means. Mass is the amount of matter that something contains. What does that mean? Before we move on, I would like to explain to you what mass means. Mass it's like weight, all right? It's the amount of matter that something contains. So, it's like weight. For example, when you say this object has a larger mass than this object, that means this object is heavier than the second object. So take a look at this. A large, heavy object, such as an elephant, has a lot of mass, has a large mass. It's heavy. A small, light object, such as a maple leaf, has less mass. So, mass is similar to weight, okay? But the definition for mass is the amount of matter that something contains. And now we know what matter is. How is mass measured? With a pan balance. Do you see this pan balance? This is how you measure mass. So if you have an object and you want to measure the mass of that object, you use a pan balance. Okay, now we know the measuring tool for mass. But what about the measuring unit? Well, basically, there are 3 measuring units for mass. You can measure mass in milligrams, or grams, or kilograms. The lighter the object, if the object is really light, you will use milligram. If it's a little bit heavy or medium size, you will use grams. And if it's really heavy, you use kilograms. So, let's take a look at the examples. This is a stamp. It's so light. It's as light as a feather. So if you want to measure the mass of a stamp, you will have to use milligrams because it's a very light object. If you want to measure the mass of salt particles, you will have to use milligrams. or if you want to measure sugar particles or pepper, you will use milligrams, okay? But if you want to measure the mass of something that is a little bit heavier than a stamp and then salt particles and sugar particles, like a paper clip or a piece of paper, then you can use grams. But if you move on to heavier objects such as a book or a pair of shoes, then you definitely have to use kilograms. Moving on. Let's see now if you guys can tell which unit you can use to measure these objects, okay? Remember, you can either use milligrams, grams, or kilograms. So, what I want you to do right now is to go grab a piece of paper, put this video on pause, so that when you come back, you can write the answers down, okay? All right, let's take a look at this object. This is a pencil. Which unit would you use to measure the mass of this pencil? Would you use milligrams, grams, or kilograms? I'll give you a minute to write the answer. Moving on. Take a look at this gorilla. It's really heavy. It has a large mass. So which one will you use? Milligrams, grams, or kilograms? Moving on. A bee. A bee is a very small insect, really light. It has a small mass, a very small mass. Which unit would you use? Would you use milligrams, grams, or kilograms? Remember, milligrams is used to measure the mass of very light objects. Kilograms, on the other hand, is used to measure very heavy objects. So, take a look at the watermelon. Which unit would you use? Again, milligrams, grams, or kilograms. And then you've got a baseball. Which one would you use? And then that's a picture of a nut. Okay, a hazelnut. So you decide. Take a moment, because right now we're going to go and correct your answers. Let's see if you guys did a good job or not. All right. So, if you chose grams for a pencil, you're absolutely right. And then if you chose kilograms for the gorilla, again, you're right. Remember, a gorilla has a very heavy mass. So that's why we use, or has a very large mass. That's why we use kilograms. If you've chosen milligrams for the bee, then you're absolutely right, because a bee has very small mass, very little mass. A watermelon, again, very heavy, has a lot of mass, so we use kilograms. A baseball, in between, so we use grams. And then a peanut, or a nut, you can measure that in using milligrams, because a peanut is very light. Okay, now that you had a general idea about mass, let's take a look at volume. Let's find out what volume means. Volume is the amount of space that matter takes up. So volume is the amount of the amount of space that matter takes up. What does that mean? Well, basically, matter, as you know, is divided into 3 states: solids, liquids, and gases. If you want to measure the volume of a solid, well, that's easy. There's a mathematical formula that I will teach you right now. And if you want to measure the volume of a liquid, also easy. All you have to do is put it in a graduated cylinder where there are measurements, and then all you got to do is just read the measurement, and then you'll find out the volume. let's watch a video that will help explain to you what I mean.
Welcome to the IntelliLearn video library, Volume and Mass, a comparison. Volume refers to the three-dimensional size of an object. It doesn't matter if that object is a liquid, solid, or even a gas. All will have their own volume, depending on their three-dimensional size. Consider three 1-litre containers, each one containing a completely different substance. Firstly, consider 1 litre of air. Secondly, 1 litre of solid lead. And thirdly, 1 litre of water. You can say that they all have exactly the same volume, because they all have the same three-dimensional size. It doesn't matter at all that they are different substances. Now let's consider their masses, which for our purposes is the same as weight. Firstly, the air. 1 litre of air isn't going to be very heavy. However, 1 litre of solid lead is going to be very heavy, much heavier than 1 litre of air. Lastly, 1 litre of water will be moderately heavy. It will be heavier than 1 litre of air, but not as heavy as 1 litre of lead. From this example, you should see the difference between volume and mass. Whilst different objects may have the same volume, their masses may be very different. In the same way, two objects that have the same mass may have very different volumes.
Alright, measuring volume. There are two ways in which you can measure volume. You can measure volume of a regular solid if you have a cube or a book or a regular solid that has a regular shape, whether it's a rectangle, whether it's an object that has a regular shape. There's a mathematical formula for that, which is you measure the length times the width and the height of that object. So if you have all three measurements, you can easily measure the volume of a regular solid. But if you have a rock, a piece of rock, that's an irregular solid. So you can't really define the length and the height and the width. So you can't use the mathematical formula. So instead, you will have to use a graduated cylinder, fill the graduated cylinder with, or the beaker, fill it up with water, drop this irregular solid, which is, for example, a stone in there, and then mark the rise of the water level. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, let's take a look at what I mean further. This is a graduated cylinder, which is used to measure the volume of an irregular solid, like a rock, piece of rock. Over here though, because this is a regular solid, so you can actually determine the width and the height and the length, you can use the mathematical formula, which is length times width times height. So if you have a rectangular prism, you can easily measure the volume by using this formula. But if you have a rock or any object that is irregular, it doesn't have a perfect shape, you can't determine the length, the width, the height. So you will have to measure the volume by using a graduated cylinder. What you do is you fill the graduated cylinder with water, colored water, and then you record the level of the water without dropping the object in it. For example, here the level of the water without the object is 7. When I dropped my object, my irregular solid, the solid that doesn't have a definite shape, the water level rose to 9. Now, to measure the volume, I subtract 9 from 7, and that gives me 2. So the volume of this irregular solid is 2. So whenever you have an object that doesn't have a regular shape, it's an irregular solid, use the graduated cylinder to measure the volume of that solid. Finally, length. What is length? Well, length tells you how long something is. All right? Length tells you how long something is. Now, basically, you can measure the length of any object using two things. A ruler, which we are all familiar with, or a measuring tape. And you need to know that length, the measuring unit for length could be either in centimeters or meters. Now, when do we use centimeters and when do we use meters? If you want to measure the length of something that is small or short, you use centimeters. But if you want to measure the length of something that is extremely long or tall, you use meters. So if I asked you to measure the length of a pencil, you would measure it in centimeters. But if I asked you to measure the length of a skateboard, you would use meters. And that's the end of our lesson. Thank you, grade 4.